grew up in South Africa, and I studied fine art degree in South Africa, but I was always interested in ceramics. At school I did ceramics, so I started working the pottery wheel from age of 15 or so. So, you know, I've been working on the pottery wheel for 30 years, and then it's always been this thing of wanting to be fine artist, be craftsman. I don't know where I fit, so I make, you know, bowls, make cups, mugs, but then I'm also very interested to do sculptures, so I make pots that are like sculptures or sculptures that are like pots. So probably the digital work, it fulfills more that area of it. That the artistic side, I'm interested in how we relate to the nature. In South Africa, you know, I became very interested in ecology and how things grow and the shape that they grow into. And then I'm interested in how computer code can be used to simulate or to mimic patterns of growth. And then the sort of mathematical formulas like Fibonacci systems that you find in nature, how we find that beautiful and how that can then be put into ceramic work as well. So by using computer code, I can then make forms that somehow are beautiful, like nature is beautiful. And having worked on the computer, I needed to get it out of the computer, so 3D printing does that. So I wasn't necessarily interested in 3D printing as much as generating digital information and the way to turn that into physical objects, is through the computer, through the 3D printer. Possibly the honest answer is because it's free, but that's joking. My ethos is an absolute sharing, open ethos. So even before the computer work, when I was working in ceramics, and I think it's not uncommon with ceramic people, they're very happy to share. So all my glaze formulas, you know, I share them because when some other creative artists, they can use the same recipe, but it comes out different, you know, because it's how you interpret it. So when it came to, you know, working computers and finding the open source community, it's been of great benefit to me. So the printer that I've designed, you know, for ceramic is using other people's information, but then I've published it all as open source. So I'd like to think as much as I take out of the open source, I also give back to the open source. So you know, it's really important. And I think it's the way, obviously, for ideas to develop. That a lot of the time I'm working with universities and they keep it to the university. They don't necessarily publish it. And I think that's really unfortunate. That someone does a project and then the project just dies. Whereas if you're working open source, you then put it out there, people can learn from it, they then pick it up and carry it forward. I think first with the software, what is of interest to me, as I said right earlier on, was the idea of working in some sort of code. In other words, being able to generate forms out of numbers and out of patterns and, you know, copying nature or using natural processes. So then for me, because I'm not a computer scientist or engineer, processing is very good, so my choice is processing there. Blender, as we were discussing in the workshop, again, open source, it's really for everybody to use, has then become, you know, a nice natural software for me to use as well. So I generate the work in processing, and then I do my editing, a bit like with photos. You might take a photo, JPEG, and then you finish it in Photoshop. I produce, or I generate my form in processing, and then I do the editing in Blender, so that gives it size, scale. I might change it a little bit, bigger, smaller, and vary it. And then the slicing software, if it's very simple form, I find Slicer 3R works very easily, and it's much easier to set up. So, but right at the beginning I started using SkyForge, and I find that most often with the more complicated shapes, SkyForge is better. So I tend to use SkyForge for that. Might be because, you know, I kind of work in clay, I'm off the earth, I like to think I'm off the earth. For me it's important about living now. So in an odd way, I think working digitally is absolutely appropriate. Because if we look around us, it's digital everywhere. So why aren't ceramics going digital? So there's it's almost a little bit of a criticism that we should be working particularly. It's not, oh, is it different or anything like that. And it's not to say I still don't use old techniques. I think where it'll be interesting is possibly to mix techniques. And I absolutely appreciate that a lot of the knowledge I can use when 3D printing in ceramics is knowledge that I gained from old-fashioned techniques, be it coil building or throwing. And the knowledge of clay has come over the years also through all of doing that. So I think of it more just as a tradition, but a new tradition. Traditions, you know, in some years' time, then we'll look back and something else will be happening and they think, oh, I remember how we used to think 3D printing was so clever. You know, it's now just the norm. In other words, tradition is a continuum, it just carries on, and this is the front edge of where tradition is. I came to Faenza last time 30 years ago. At that stage, what it was, we were still, my wife and I were still living in South Africa, and we came over and we were touring around, looking at art in Europe and educating ourselves. And for me, it was a big education coming to the Faenza Museum, particularly. We didn't have time to really go to studios. And the education was because most of what I'd seen was British ceramics, and then I suppose American and British ceramics. And when we came to Faenza, it was more European ceramics, and particularly at that stage, it was still when there's a division between East and West, and Faenza was showing a lot of what was then Eastern Bloc ceramics coming out of Russia, and being a South African, we weren't seeing any of that. So right back from then, I've always thought that Faenza has been a good melting pot for ceramics, because if you work in USA, work in England, you start to just only look at sort of English or American ceramics, and you forget that there's ceramics all over the world. And because I come from South Africa, I'm particularly interested in ceramic cultures and more the traditional, so in other words, African ceramics or Native American ceramics, beautiful ceramics. And out in China, often it's not necessarily the celadons, although I do like the celadons, but it's the much earlier ceramics that I'm personally interested in. So, to come to Faenza was this big melting pot of ceramics that became a memory.